Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another art stream with myself, Pharaoh, and we've got my co-host, Alexander Adams. How you doing?
Not too bad. A little bit nervous about what's coming this weekend, but hopefully we can distract ourselves.
Exactly. And we've also got the venerable Panama Hat. How you doing?
Thank you very much. I'm doing absolutely fine.
Wonderful. And we've got Al as well. Al, how you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks.
Okay, brilliant. So today we are going to continue our look at art and political power, and we've gone on a real journey from the beginning of history, really, to the 20th century. And I guess we'll just kick off. I was just trying to remember what was some of the last things we saw. We saw some kind of the beginnings of kind of Soviet art. We had that chap who was the kind of
Constantin Meunier, who was the Belgian sculptor who did the social realism, which became the template for socialist realism, which we'll be discussing in this stream.
Okay, brilliant. And we had a variety of other stuff. We had the beautiful was it the Princess of Portugal from Panama?
Oh, Queen Isabella of Spain. Yes.
Oh, yes.
With all her aristocrats on horseback. Yes.
Yes, exactly.
Quite a remarkable picture.
And various other things. But I guess 21st century, we've got loads of stuff going on. We've got 2 world wars, the kind of aftermath of that, and hundreds and hundreds of art movements happening all at the same time. So really interesting period. And I guess we're going to kick off with one of Alexander's first pictures, and I shall just share in a second. Can you guys see this?
Yep.
Yeah.
Cool.
So this is
So
this is let me get the information up. Okay, so this is Kirchner's Marcella from 1909 to 1910. So this is an example of Expressionism. So Expressionism kicks off in basically it's sort of around 1905, 1908, that sort of period. And that's when Expressionism kicks off. You could say that Van Gogh was there first, but the movement itself kicks off. And then it has different strands. The strand we're looking at here is German. I think this is the most interesting in terms of politics, because what's notable about one of the characteristics of Expressionism here, for example, this one comes from the idea of primitivism. So you had a number of the Expressionists were interested in sort of primitive, non-European culture, because they looked at Gauguin and they followed his example and said, basically, European art has become compromised by its sophistication, by its pandering to bourgeois taste, to refinement, to technicality. So it's become sort of decadent, both technically and morally, and it needs to become more earthy, more direct, more primal. So this is an example of so obviously a big subject that comes up is the portrait and also the nude, and the nude, of course, is linked to sort of primitive societies, so-called primitive societies, not wearing clothing, having different sexual morality to the morality of the Edwardian age. And so this was essentially it was an appeal to primitivism, for art to get in touch with its essentialist nature, its roots. But it was also it has been criticized, and I think occasionally fairly, for sort of indulging in the creator's sort of sexual proclivities and so forth. So you have a lot of sort of youngish girls and a lot of sort of native women who are depicted in relatively submissive situations. And I'm not a fan of post-colonial and feminist critique, but it does seem that this does seem to be an attraction for the creators and the consumers of this kind of art.
Yes, it's interesting that kind of turn of the century and the kind of the young girl. Another one I was thinking of was maybe like someone like Egon Schiele, who was like I think he ran off with several young women as well. There's an interesting vein of I know
libertinage, maybe.
Yes, yeah, for sure. But like, I think what's interesting about this for me is obviously, the pose where we did Olympia last time, didn't we?
Yeah,
as a while ago. Yeah. So again, so like the nude is typically kind of reclining, or in a relatively submissive and sensual pose. While there's a sort of intensity to this painting where she's kind of leaning forward. You can see kind of the shoulders leaning in, and she's looking straight at you. There's a brazenness to that. And again, like the colors as well are just kind of like so striking with the kind of yellow background and stuff. So I think it's a really interesting picture in terms of like the kind of impact the Expressionists had like on the landscape of the time. Was it something where again they kind of were picked up by like a dedicated few, and then kind of grew, or sort of like blew up like decades later, or were they shunned?
I mean, they're part of this sort of back to nature movements, because there were a lot of movements at the time. So there was the veganism movement, there was there was the dress reform movement, there was the nudist movement, the naturalist movement. So there were all these different movements to do with sort of liberation and sort of stripping away refinement and so forth. So they're very much part of the cultural zeitgeist. In terms of how popular it was and who actually consumed it, I can't say, but it did have a lot of impact in sort of bohemian and sort of liberated circles.
Yeah, because again, I guess the only thinking in the UK shores, you had someone like Roger Fry in like 1910 going to Europe and collecting Picasso and Cézanne as well, I think. So again, like some key art critics were kind of identifying and picking up on the stuff. So this wasn't exactly like super niche, but it wasn't exactly, your middle class society wouldn't really check it out or whatever, would they? So
yeah.
Okay, cool. So moving on, Al, this is one of yours.
Yeah, this is one of mine, and I'll just bring up because I'll get the name of the chap. Okay.
It has Boccioni written at the top.
Boccioni, yeah, that's right. I've got a lot of fascist art tabs at the moment. Yeah, get my notes up.
Would you? Because I guess it's tied to like Italian futurism, so I don't know if
this is Boccioni's Noise, and I mean, so the painting itself, it represents, I guess you would say, city life, and one of the things which was I think quite interesting about this one is at this time, city life, especially in Italy, because Italy at that, you have to think, relatively speaking, within people's lifetime, it was a relatively new country. The city landscapes were drastically different. The buildings, architecture, and everything else was drastically different. And also, the fact that after the First World War, you had a sort of a technological boom in aviation, and which we'll see in a bit later as well. So from what I see of this part of the futurism thing, it was I guess it was more like a reimagining of what a city is like. And so from this we have I think it's like a sort of a square, and so you have the sort of like traditional sort of I can't make out whether it's like just a fair in the center there, or a wedding or something. So and then of course you got like the surrounding properties and everything, and yeah, as you said, this is sort of your early futurism take on that sort of the sort of new world, you could say, of their sort of what they imagine their sort of society will go on to be, because of course and this is quite an interesting thing about it, is you take Germany and Italy, and why it's very prevalent in both nations is, again, they're new nations. They're no longer constrained by the old borders, the old kingdoms, and such. And so for them, this was a reimagining of the identity.
Yeah, so I guess like one of the key influences is something like Cubism, where Picasso is trying to take multiple viewpoints and sort of mashing them together into a single view, and that's why you've got something like the kind of horse popping out here. But just to explain it, like Alex, I know you've got a couple of bits on futurism as well here. I don't know if you want to do a bit of an intro to everyone.
Yeah, well, this is Umberto Boccioni. So this is the same artist. This is an example of another example of futurism. So one of the characteristics of futurism is its interest. Well, go through the list of things that are characteristic about futurism are an interest in mechanization, an interest in speed and dynamism, and this is something that really comes out in the paintings that you have. An intense interest in depicting modern machinery and modern life, trying to evoke sound, movement, color. It is in a sense a little bit consumerist because it's quite caught up in sort of materialism. But it's essentially very modern, and they were defiantly anti-tradition. So, for example, they would say that I think I can't remember, it was Marinetti or someone said that basically that you would the canals should be diverted to flood museums. They were opposed to museums. They didn't actually commit any acts of iconoclasm, but they were iconoclastic in spirit. So yes, it's Marinetti. Yeah, so I think it's Marinetti who talks about.
Yeah, there you go. We will destroy the museums. Like, so what I sort of love about the futurists is that they put in this very succinct manifesto where they just sort of listed everything they wanted, but the kind of demands are like slightly esoteric and random. But some of them are very definite. Yeah, we will destroy the museums, libraries, and academies of every kind. So, we will fight moralism, feminism. It's interesting. It's kind of almost. Nietzschean, where they're trying to create this.
Oh yes, they were very influenced by Nietzsche. Yeah.
Find the new man. Everything must be destroyed in the past, but also there's a kind of progressive element as well.
So you can see that's the kernel of fascism. So it's the technological advances, also with the kind of the both adulation of the past and also hostility to the bourgeois. So that's very, very common in fascism. So that's why you see that fascism rises first in Italy, and was it, I think, 1923 or something.
Yeah, it's interesting seeing how they pull in some of those that the kind of machine revolution. So you can see here, we affirm that the world's magnificence has been enriched by a new beauty, the beauty of speed, the racing car whose hood is adorned with great pipes like serpents of explosive breath. I mean, the language is so evocative and almost kind of ridiculous for like if you're thinking this as a manifesto. But I mean, stylistically, they're trying to take some of those early modern ideas, but then also just add in all of those kind of like ideas of the future as well. Just before we carry on, Panama as a bit of an Evola expert, do you know if there's any connection between the futurists and like influencing him at all, or is there any interesting connection there?
He was certainly part of that milieu around the futurists, and I believe he was actually he met Marinetti on several occasions. But Evola never really, I mean, as you probably know, he never really kind of took on that whole futurist approach. He was far more concerned with the kind of core ideas of our past, and how they kind of came about. His paintings in this era were mostly he was more aligned with the Dada people than with the with the futurists, it seems. And he was quite big on art that attacked the bourgeoisie. That was his main project around this time, it seems.
Yeah, it's interesting because obviously they're both kind of anti-bourgeois, but obviously Evola being such a strong traditionalist. But okay, well, let's maybe bring him up in a second. But do you want to keep on chatting through some of the Boccioni stuff?
Yeah, we might as well. Well, we might as well go to the next one.
Oh no, hold on a second. There we go.
So this is a Goncharova. So this is a Russian artist. The Russians were quite deeply involved in Cubism and Cubo-futurism. This is Cubo-futurism, which basically means slightly fewer lines than the average the average futurist painting. There's not that much difference. It's slightly flatter. It's slightly more decorative. The futurist art has a tendency to be very insistent. And busy. So this is Goncharova. Goncharova was part of the Russian avant-garde, so which includes Malevich and Tatlin and a couple of others who visited Paris and looked at principally not Picasso, but the Salon futurists, the Salon Cubists, who exhibited in sort of 1909, 1910, 1911. And they took these ideas back to Moscow. So this was the kernel of something we'll see later. But this is an example of a Russian adopting the sort of the French and Italian art styles of Cubism and Futurism. Again, here we have an adulation of movement and machinery.
Yeah, exactly. And I one of the things I do really love is that these kind of like multiple. It's almost like seeing a several scenes from a camera, all one after the other. So you've got those kind of positions at the back and stuff. But again, there's kind of strong movement in there, but also things like the kind of large, bold writing slapped right in front of the person. You know, it looks like they're posters in the background, but then they're kind of pulling it forward. It makes it really interesting. But obviously super influential. Sorry, I've moved him to. He needs to go a little bit later. We didn't put any Dada stuff in here, but I don't know if you want to. Would you say they're kind of political at all? Like, I guess
obviously the Dada was something that was born in, I think there's was born during the First World War. One of the centers was Zurich, because a lot of the artists fled to neutral Switzerland, so they went to Zurich. So you've got artists such as Kurt Schwitters and Marcel Duchamp. And Dada, yes, Dada is political in the sense that it's a rejection of the bourgeois. It's a rejection of militarism. It's a rejection of the church and of monarchies. It's essentially anti-authoritarian, anti-establishment, and it also has, I think, in a way, you could describe it as a nihilistic movement. It's so interested in promoting the absurd and the ridiculous and the nonsensical that it verges into the territory of believing in nothing, trusting in nothing, promoting nothing. Now, in one way, you could say, oh, that's a very moral stance because they're opposing things that had brought the destruction and the insanity of the First World War. On the other hand, you could say, well, the things that they're advocating don't bring any more sense or order to the world. So this is actually a form of nihilism, and it's actually quite destructive. They don't necessarily make specifically political pictures, but the movement itself was expressly political.
Yeah, just like one of the funny things is I'm not sure who it was, but one of them dressed up like a bishop and would do these kind of like random services in a club once a week on a Sunday using a small rubber duck. So, or again, who's the poet beginning with Z? I can't remember his name, but he would do his kind of deconstructed poems.
Would that be Tristan Zara?
Oh yeah, Zara. Yeah.
Silent T. Yeah.
Yeah, he would like have a whole lot of words from a newspaper and then construct poetry by just chucking them up in the air and picking stuff out.
Basically, and of course, the thing about Dada and why I believe it didn't last very long in its original incarnation is that, of course, as I think as Al said, it kind of it refutes so much. Its whole point is that it refutes and kind of makes fun of everything.
Yeah.
So, for example, you had some of them that became communists and then kind of fell out with the movement because, you have to make fun of everything if you're going to commit to this. You can't be one thing and then just sort of, tear down everything else. And of course, you had Evola, who moved away from it because he felt it had become too formulaic and kind of it developed its own style, which it can't do if it wants to stay true to its principles.
Like Evola is pretty. I wouldn't describe his art as very traditional at all. Maybe something like this.
That's not Evola.
That's a different one.
Yes.
Isn't. But I mean, but the thing about his traditionalism is that it's wrapped up in this kind of rejection of bourgeois modernity. So I mean, you don't have to explicitly be traditional in order to be traditional in a sense. I mean, for the same reason, I mean, I'm quite sympathetic to quite a lot of modernist writers and artists and things like that, because I don't believe that you just have to stick to random examples from the past. You do have to kind of look for the kind of the elements that made those things traditional and kind of work from that, basically.
Yeah, he's not necessarily like a hardcore reactionary, as in he wants to recreate the past exactly, but take elements from that in a kind of a new path or whatever, isn't it?
Essentially.
Yeah. Okay. Let's keep on moving. I wanted to put in the Vorticists, just quickly, just a little aside. So again, the Futurists did a show in England, and there's a couple of kind of key artists, including Wyndham Lewis, and they created this rather magnificent piece of graphic design, which is their kind of would you call it a manifesto, Alexander?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's sort of part promo, part manifesto. So yeah.
And it's called Blast. And what I just sort of love the graphic nature of it. So again, this is I think it's 1912, and it was kind of like a part magazine, part manifesto. Had various bits of their work in. Vorticism is very futurist in style, but I think just
we should point out that this was developed during the First World War in London.
Yeah. But as like. I think almost the graphic side is the more original side. Again, this could be straight out of the 60s or the 70s, but done in the 1910s, I thought was quite pretty cool. I don't know if you have anything to say about the Vorticists at all.
Me, not so much. I mean, you would say that they're just basically British versions of futurism.
Yeah, like again, I think it's ironically the graphic elements which are more unique. But okay, cool. On to
so this is Vladimir Tatlin. So this is Russian artist, created in the immediate aftermath of the revolution of 1917. This is a classic example of constructivism. So this is basically with the Soviets. They, in the early years, we'll see this changes quite rapidly, but in the early years, they were very in favor of experimental art. They talked about sort of building new buildings and new art for this liberated man, for the Soviet man. And this would include art that would be of a radical nature, so it would destroy the bourgeois formalism of representational art, and you end up with things like there were parades of art, so artists were involved in making banners, in sculptures, and constructions like this one, which is sort of halfway between an architectural model and a sculpture. You had all sorts of very radical plans to change the way everyone's life was, which is, of course, the way that utopian societies always start out, and they don't last that way very long. So the constructivist phase lasted, not even 10 years. So by the mid-20s, there was already a reluctance or a recognition from the authorities, from the Soviet authorities, that radicalism in the arts was not winning over the proletariat as they had hoped, and so there was going to have to be a sort of a return to tradition, as it were. But at this initial stage, this is part of the radical, reformist, progressivist, anti-bourgeois stage of the revolution, which died out within 7 years or so.
Yeah, so I guess kind of like Lenin's Soviet regime is exceedingly kind of like about pushing boundaries and totally changing society, and then Stalin is that kind of return to tradition. But I think what's interesting is just how important art became as like a physical manifestation of the Lenin's vision. And again, I think something like this, well, because again there was like schemes where they would obviously like actively promote these kind of new radical artists. Again, there's a lot of pressure from the Communist Party about being seen to create this kind of art. There's some interesting stuff where like from the poetry side as well. I don't know, Panama, if you've got anything to say, where again they were kind of pushing a certain kind of poet during that kind of early stage, but then there was a lot of kind of hankering for the past, and so that kind of later revision. But one thing that struck me, again, sorry, I did just notice at the last minute, was how much this reminds me of the orbital slide from Stratford. I don't know if it's intentional at all, but I don't know if you can see the slide and the trumpet down there, but maybe that's just me.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, the thing is, I think that maybe just the mechanics of building something like that, you just have to adopt that form. So it's a question of form following function, maybe.
Okay, that's true. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so this is from the immediate post-war period. This is George Grosz. This is a later cover for a catalogue of his art later on. So this is an engraving. George Grosz served in the First World War along with Otto Dix, who we'll see in a minute, and had a pretty rough time. He came back to, I think it was Berlin, and so basically this was a period of great disruption and unsettlement. And of course, we don't need to go into the early years of the Weimar Republic, because it's kind of very obvious why. There was lots of political feeling. There was a lot of resentment against the ruling class. There was a lot of veterans, a lot of disfigured veterans, especially. With the rampant inflation, prostitution became rampant because women, especially widows, had no form of support, so they had to go into that area to earn money. Berlin, of course, was a centre of debauchery. And so you had artists sort of both reveling in that and critiquing it as well. So this is, I think, a good sort of satirical work of art by George Grosz, satirizing post-war Berlin or interwar Berlin. Yeah,
you can see the kind of like the fat cat at the back there in a pork pie hat. Yeah. Rosy, like you can see the gout, even though it's in black and white, or the kind of woman.
Yes.
Women in the negligee. I think what's interesting about a lot of the Weimar stuff is that it's a very intense art style, but also just so sort of depressing. There's a very sinister undertone to it as well.
Yeah. So this is another work. I'll just get up the details here. So this is another painting this is a painting by George Grosz from the 1920s. Again, this is just sort of an extension of what we've already seen. So you have a city life. Grosz was a painter of cities. So you have the dog walkers, the sort of prostitute woman, average men. You have the scarred veteran. You have the anonymity of urban life.
Where's the veteran?
Well, I mean the guy facing who's got his decorations, who's got his Iron Cross.
You mean the guy right in the front with the military stuff? Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, cool. that would be the veteran. Yes,
he's also looking quite malnourished as well.
Yeah, and
compared
you can talk about sort of maybe shell shock or something, that he doesn't look very well adjusted.
No.
Yeah.
I think he's sort of like looking at the viewer and just like, are you seeing this, dude?
Are you seeing what I'm seeing? Yes.
I literally fought a war for this, basically.
Yes.
So stylistically, so obviously, this is a slight move away from those kind of like multiple snapshots of Cubism, or that kind of focus on speed. Does this kind of like Weimar style have like a particular name?
There isn't a specific Weimar style. We'll talk about Neue Sachlichkeit in a minute, but this is a sort of this isn't really which means new realism, new objectivity. Sorry. And this doesn't actually conform to that, but here you see there's lots of cubist things, like you've got the lettering, which is very Dadaist. You've got the sort of flat panels, so the flat facets, which come from Cubism. Then you've got the sort of sense of movement, and that comes from Futurism. So this is a sort of an amalgam style. There isn't a sort of set style of the Weimar Republic, but this is one of the styles that becomes characteristic of the Weimar Republic. And in fact, you can say one of the things about the Weimar Republic is that it was perhaps too diverse, and that was one of the things that brought about its downfall.
That's where you're wrong. You can never have too much diversity.
Sorry, diversity is our strength. Sorry.
Okay, next one.
Okay, so here's it's just an ink drawing. So this is another attack on the authorities. So you have figures from the church, and you have figures from the military, and of course there was this idea that the church and the military, and not shown here, but the industrial corporations had all worked to betray the country, and that this left a sort of sense of bitterness amongst veterans such as George Gross. And so I think this is a good example of how scapegoats were being found at a time during the 1920s, when you have the rise of the group that will finally destroy the Weimar Republic.
The mid-century Germans.
The mid-century Germans.
Yeah, and again, obviously taking them account of the church as well. So again, I think what's interesting for this period is that from a subject matter perspective, it's almost like all bars have been removed, because again, like because again, if you think about like kind of early Cubists, yeah, they'll have like Picasso had prostitutes and like naked women, etc. I mean, it was pretty radical, but like in terms of political targets, I'm trying to think. It's really...
Picasso's not really a political artist. Well, okay, yeah, maybe I'm going to make a suggestion to you privately in chat about a Picasso painting that is. Unless you've already got Guernica in there. I
haven't, but we can put it in.
Well, I mean, it's probably been done to death, but yeah. Picasso is not really a political artist. So I think it's probably best to avoid politics in Picasso.
Yeah, but I guess in general, like 1910, like from a subject matter point of view, didn't really go. I mean, it's something like this is a pretty hardcore attack on all forms of authority and established hierarchy, isn't it? So I think the First World War had a huge impact on the kind of psyche, and also, I think it just showed how lax the Weimar rules were, going from a society where you probably would be shot for treason for some kind of like gay marriage ceremony between the German generals. Do you know what I'm saying? To stuff like this being relatively popular. So.
Okay, so this is Otto Dix. Otto Dix was another artist, another veteran of the First World War. Made some really, really great etchings of the First World War, which I didn't include, but this is slightly more interesting because this is a later work from 29 to 32. It's called War. And of course, you'll notice that this is a format, this is a triptych format, which you commonly find in religious paintings. So this is harking back to the North German tradition of Renaissance altarpieces from the early 16th century. So artists like Grunfeld and Altdorf and so forth. So here you have scenes of war set in the First World War. Yeah, so you have the infantry soldiers on the left with passing a wheel of probably of a supply cart or maybe artillery. And then in the center you have the horrors of the trenches, including a figure in a gas mask. And then on the right, you have perhaps a ghost, or a ghostly figure at least, surrounded by burning and a burnt tree, supporting a comrade. And below you have the dead bodies, the dead of the war in there. So this is actually, in a way, this reminds me a little bit of the Wiertz painting that we looked at last time of the man in the coffin, breaking out of the coffin. So this is an example of a sort of a classicizing tendency that you'll find coming up in the 1920s and 1930s. But again, of course, very political, very anti-war.
Yeah, so it's really interesting for on so many different levels. You know, for me, there's almost something like Boccian about it, with the kind of the twisted landscape, and again, like I'm pretty sure they wouldn't have had. Oh, again, I wasn't there, but you know, these kind of bodies all kind of twisted in that kind of way is probably like an exaggeration of things, but it creates that kind of almost surreal element to it. I love the kind of skeleton pointing to, you know, you have to go over, there's your death, basically. But you know, also maybe the wheel is like the wheel of fortune going into war, but it's pretty, you know, it's pretty horrific in terms of like, as a really graphic piece of art, but also you know, very very powerful at the same time. And again, the importance of the triptych as well, where he's pulling on these kind of the religious ideas, and it's kind of like this is the reality of war. You know, it's not nice. But the classicism is interesting again as well, because everything we've seen from 1900 has been this kind of very or like relatively abstract, and now you've got this, you know,
this is definite reaching back into the past, and specifically the German past, in order to represent the suffering of Germany in the modern day.
They're very powerful.
So this is a painting called Lotti by Christian Schad. Christian Schad was a member of the Neue Sachlichkeit, the new objectivity movement, which arose in the late 1920s and continued into the early 30s, and it was kind of snuffed out by the rise of, well, we're going to have to say the name, aren't we? We're going to have to say the Nazis at some stage. So yeah, so it was snuffed out by the we can't discuss Nazi art without saying the word Nazi. So sorry for your monetization.
Demonetized. Don't worry, I'm not even monetized right now anyway. So
yeah, so this is just an example of Weimar Germany. So you have the cross-dressing, as it were. I mean, it's not strictly speaking cross-dressing, but it's certainly unconventional dressing. You've got the cocktail glass in the background. You have the sort of flat background, which sort of is a reference to modernism, Cubism, and so forth. But again, it's also got it's highly realistic in some respects. So I mean, the face in particular is quite realistic. So this is a fusion. So the Neue Sachlichkeit were sort of people who were interested in urban life. They were very interested in portraits, paintings based in sort of the underworld, especially the Berlin underworld. So this is a good example of the art that was sort of circulating. I don't know if you've seen the Babylon Berlin series.
No, it's on Now TV, and I refuse to give the.
Well, I've buy a DVD.
That's a good point. Yeah.
The first two series are really, really good, and they're set in this world, and it's very interesting. I've heard that the third series is not so good, but anyway. But I can recommend the first two series.
Yeah. Did you see Al?
Yeah, I've seen like that. I think I've only just recently watched I think the first 3 episodes of the first season so far.
Would you recommend?
Yeah, I would. It's quite interesting. It's got quite a lot of characters. My one criticism, there's a lot. They introduce a lot of characters very quickly.
Yeah, they do get tied up, but yeah, there's a lot to deal with. It's lots of strands to start with.
Yeah, but I guess it gives you a good background to it.
Yep. So this is another painting by Christian Schad. Again, this is sort of like a nightclub scene. So this is, I'm assuming this is a cross-dresser. I'm not sure. Maybe it's a masculine woman or a cross-dresser.
Well, there's literally the song. There's literally the song, isn't there? Masculine and women and feminine men. What is it? Who's the rooster? Who is the hen? Have you heard that song before?
No, I haven't heard that.
No, I'll send that around later. There's like a famous song from the 20s where again it's like challenging that. But I think So
this is a good example of that. So anyway, I mean, you all know about the Weimar scene in the 1920s in Berlin. So lots of cross-dressing, lots of homosexual sex, male and female. You know, you've got bars dedicated to gay life and so forth. And this is sort of just a representation of the life as it was under the Weimar Republic, where you had lots of boundaries being crossed. You also have the rise of the New Woman. That, strictly speaking, the New Woman it arises in the Edwardian period. And this is basically where you have dress reform, women going into the workplace, women becoming more independent, the rise of the bicycle, which allows women to travel more, and also public transport, which allows women to go into the center of cities and work. So this is a time of great flux. And of course, a lot of women going into the workplace in the 1920s in Berlin and in other parts of Germany and the rest of Europe, because of the death of so many men. You have women taking lots of secretarial work, so clerking work and so forth, and minor menial work as well. So this is an example of the social changes. Christian Schad, I think he was sort of slightly left-wing, but I don't think he was, I'm not sure that he was overtly political, but obviously his art reflects political changes of the time. Okay, so this is American. So this is by Thomas Hart Benton. Just get this up now. So this is by Thomas Hart Benton, and it's called America Today. It was it's a mural painted in 1930 to 31. The technique is rather curious. So America hasn't really come up much in our discussions so far, but it's going to become more important, obviously, over this century. Now, the Americans had a problem in that they wanted to create their own artistic identity, but they were kind of floundering because they didn't have a unified population, they didn't have a unified nation, they didn't have an indigenous culture, because of course we're talking about the colonial culture of the white American immigrants and their descendants. So they had this problem. Well, how do we make our own contribution to the history of art as a great nation, which we think we are, if we don't have a unified style, if we don't have a unified history? And so what they decided was, one of the things they did was they came up with the idea that the landscape itself would be their contribution to art. So then you have the Hudson River School, which is a group of American landscape painters working in the 19th century. So you have this idea of regionalism. So actually the country itself will become America's contribution to the history of art. Here we have modern forms of America being taken up as Americans' contribution towards society. So you've got the cinema, you've got the bar, you've got ballroom dancing, or dancing in a bar at least. You have an acrobat, and yeah. And this was part of regionalism. Regionalism was Thomas Hart Benton, and that was his principal movement. There were other painters as well. For example, American Gothic is painted in the American regionalist style. And regionalism was basically, it was an unhappy, it's an unhappy hybrid of modernity and traditionalism. So the technique here is egg tempera on linen, which is a very old-fashioned technique for a very modern picture. And he was very interested in using traditional techniques and using traditional materials to depict American life, but also in a representational way. So it's kind of like it's an unhappy fusion of old techniques and modern imagery as a reaction against the modernism of Expressionism and Constructivism and Cubism and Matisse and so forth. It was a rejection of European modernism as decadent, and it was showing that America could be vital, but it would use the old techniques of the Renaissance and combine it with its own modern technology. It's a bit of a mishmash, really.
Yeah, there's some interesting, for example, like the hand there really reminds me of Adam's hand in the Reef of the Sistine Chapel.
Yeah.
So again, there are those kind of, and again, maybe the background again with some of those kind of bits of perspective in there. But it's a very strange vibe I'm getting from this. It is very disjointed.
Yeah, you've got these insets which are Art Deco. So it's and of course this was I think this was for a headquarters for a boardroom of an American corporation. It was eventually removed. I think it's now in the Metropolitan Museum.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And this is another painting. So this is regionalism at its finest, drawing on an artist called Pinkham Ryder. But this is a Hart Benton again. This is a painting of a harvest. So here again, this is sort of like getting back to the roots. So this was, the way that the German expressionists, they went to Africa or so forth to get to the inspiration that Gauguin had got. So here we have Hart Benton going to the heartland of America and saying, what is American is the people, is the landscape, is the working man. And of course, this connects quite nicely with what we'll see with socialist realism and also Nazism. One interesting extra point is, do you know who Thomas Hart Benton's most famous student was? Any ideas?
No idea.
Jackson Pollock.
Interesting.
Yeah.
No, I quite like the picture. You can see kind of like the hay bale almost has that kind of like tendrils into the ground itself. It's kind of drawn from the earth, and you've got things like the distorted perspective. Again, that's quite medieval in style. So again, it's interesting how he's pulling in some of those elements. But no, I didn't realize that this is quite socialist. Well,
yes.
So it's interesting to see America have those kind of that artistic tradition. Okay, is this in the same? I feel like this is out of order. This is 49.
Yeah. So this is not all of the picture. Could you refresh or something? That's not all of it. And that's only the top half. There we go. Yeah. So this is a painting by Tatiana Jablonska. So this is an example of socialist realism. Now, socialist realism is slightly different from social realism, but on the surface they look very similar. So it's depicting working life, ordinary people, happy, cooperative, realist style, traditional technique painting, no irony, no comedy, no criticism, politically conformist. So it was not realist in the sense of, it's realistic in a superficial sense in that you would see stuff like this, but this is not realist in the sense that this is representative of their life as a whole. This is representative of part of their life. Obviously, if you showed their apartments, they're sort of in these old buildings which have been subdivided so many times that they're sort of living in cramped, illogical spaces with damp on the walls and sort of very meager possessions and so forth. That's a side of realism that you would not get, but this is the side of the realism that you would get. So socialist realism comes in the 1930s to replace constructivism and the more modernist progressive art. I've seen different dates, but by 1936 it's codified by Stalin that the style of the Soviet Union will be socialist realism, and the purpose of socialist realism is to serve the realism of the party. The party decides what is real and what is not real. And so obviously you have these fascinating examples of portraits, group portraits of leaders of the revolution, and one by one the other figures get removed, and so you end up with Stalin.
Yeah,
you end up with the boss on his own.
I have to say, this does remind me a lot of the realism of Ilya Repin, another Russian from the 1890s.
Yes.
If I was shown this and asked to sort of name an author, aside from maybe some of the technology you can see in this in the background, or some of the way it looks, I might be tempted to guess it was a Repin.
Yeah, and the one interesting point, one of the few interesting differences between Nazi art and Soviet art, because as you'll see, there is very little difference in terms of style, is that more women were painters, because of course this accords to the Soviet ideals of equality between the sexes. So this is a painting by a woman, and you get very few Nazi artists who are female. There were a handful, but they're very much exceptions.
No, interesting. Okay, I can finally bring up the picture of Nev.
Yes. So my kind of I would have liked slightly more time to kind of plan out the images I was going to submit for this, but my my week has been a little bit chaotic, let's just say. So one of the themes I have here is kind of British and one American political leaders throughout this 100-year period, and so what interests me specifically about this one is that it's kind of still in that kind of very classical realist style of art that is still persisting among the elite, despite all the kind of artistic upheavals of this time period. This would have been, I believe, just at the start of his tenure as prime minister. And that's basically, I mean, I don't have a lot to say about this specific image, but it's kind of just more to fit in with the canon of the rest of them. But I mean, you can still see there's kind of a practiced determination there. And there's a kind of, it doesn't have the sort of bombast of the style that political leaders had their portraits painted, say in the last stream, where they would be, you know, in flowing kind of Roman garb or on horseback or whatever. There's a kind of there's a kind of quietness to it, but at the same time there's a kind of lack of any real energy for anything. You know, it's just got his sort of hands across his chest. That is not, and I think it unintentionally reflects the kind of slightly muddled atmosphere of Britain in this time. You know, at the kind of height of the economic turmoil, and without a kind of with the kind of afterglow of the First World War still keeping it on a straight track, but you know, it's still it's the kind of cracks are beginning to show in the structure.
Yeah, because I think what's interesting is, like, obviously America and France very much adopted the kind of more abstract and you know, those progressive forms of art. Well, I think certainly England in the mainstream, yes, we got those kind of smaller pockets like the Vortices, very much kind of lent on earlier Victorian traditions. You know, something like this could have been done by like a 19th century late pre-Raphaelite or like an academic painter. And so I think, you know, England definitely lags behind the continent in terms of their adoption of the kind of the modernist styles. But like you said, it sort of comes like to a bit of a head in the 30s, where, you know, everyone's, you know, basically following that futurist vision of, you know, the machine age and the future and speed, etc. And England's just sort of dawdling around, just doing its own thing, which isn't necessarily, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but
it reflects in this picture. And there's one here I've submitted of his predecessor, Mr. Stanley Baldwin, who, which it's interesting that you would have a kind of prime minister posing in a style like this. It's almost sort of laid back, although you can see there's some sort of consternation and kind of thought in his expression. It's quite, it's quite surprising, given the tradition that he came from and what was kind of how leaders were expected to look in this time. And the only kind of, there's kind of quite a sparse, austere kind of feel to this. It's very, the colors are quite plain and dark. There isn't any sort of spark to the walls. There's nothing on them. And the only kind of hint that this man is politically important is the red the red box on the table there, which has always interested me, this picture, for that reason, essentially.
Yeah, because even the details sort of been kind of washed away by the kind of impressionistic strokes. So it's kind of like you're in this kind of dreamscape, apart from him.
The cold, heartless image of the Conservative Party of what it should be.
Okay, let's compare those two to this little gem, Al.
Yeah. Well, this one's quite interesting because there were actually there's quite a number of portraits of Mussolini. There's like a two-face one, which is a quite interesting one. But this one I thought was the reason I chose this was it was, for me, it's like a U-turn that the futurists sort of went along, because as you know, that hang on a second, I'll just bring it up the notes. So Marinetti, he had his own futurist political party, and one of the big, I guess you say, part of their philosophy was that they were also quite anti-clerical. And one thing I just noticed in this image, which really stood out, was how there's like a very futuristic take on a halo around Mussolini, very much depicted as Saint Mussolini here. And you see this sort of hark back to tradition, and you see it a lot, especially sort of at the start, even up to the start of Italy's involvement in the war. And I mean, again, obviously keeping true to the form, it's very abstract. You've got he comes across actually very robotic as well, but also I mean, this is obviously the sort of pure propaganda image of a strongman, which is the purpose of this. And I'll just say, because I forgot to mention at the start, the artist is let's bring it up.
De Torre.
It is Gerardo De Torre, yeah.
Well, one like about this is that he's sort of almost emerging out of the ground. He is Italy. His head is in the clouds. It is looking to the future. That halo of the airplane, that kind of new mechanical creation that would have been a miracle to your typical Italian peasant. He is from the ground, but he is something eternal and heavenly at the same time.
I mean, yeah, and that's. I mean, there's another portrait of which is one that I'm. It's the. I think is it the Aviator? I think that might have been where he sort of won with the town and the countryside, and because that was another one I saw when I was selecting these paintings. But yeah, I mean, this is the thing. He was the sort of self-proclaimed Caesar, and he really wanted to come across as the living embodiment of the new Italy, and so yeah, a lot of the portraits, he blends in with the surroundings, and he blends in with the whether it's the countryside or the town, and so yeah, I mean, this is the sort of image that he wanted to get across to people. But I think this is interesting because this particular one with the halo and everything, you can see where I guess you could say a certain element from the futurists of a rejection of certain elements, because at that time they merged with the fascist party, and so I guess there was a give and take, and at the heart of it, getting across to the wider population for propaganda purposes, you do have to appear quite traditionalist, and you do have to appear and present yourself in a way that can resonate with the majority of the population. So this, I mean, in many ways, this is, I mean, I would say, like with the halo and everything in the back, this could be sort of any sort of standard Catholic iconography.
It's like an icon of the state rather than the church.
That's but that's the thing, because obviously at that point, I mean, while the church was still allowed and continued, but yeah, he was the that sort of element of worshipping the state. And I mean, some of the policies of the futuristic parties, abolishing the family and raising the children on the state gets to raise the children and everything, just quite open preference for that sort of society. It just goes to show like where they started, sort of, and then where they ended up. And because that was the key factor. Because they did end up with working, sort of merging and working within the Italian fascist party and within Mussolini's regime.
Yeah, just comparing the two there again. That's subdued, quite demeanor compared to the bombast of Mussolini. Okay, moving forward, we've got another pair of yours, Al.
Yeah. So now, so do you want to do this one first?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So this one is not Nosedive. This is So this is quite interesting. This is from Sansoni. He was a close friend of Marinetti, and I mean, he's quite an interesting fellow in himself, because he faked, if I remember correctly, he faked his own funeral and changed his name, and he wanted to be reborn as a futurist and everything. But yeah, with this one, and then this is something that Alexander raised before. The main purpose of this image is to show off and display the technology and the plane and the speed of it. I mean, that's really what I could say from this. It's just the sheer speed of the image and of the planes in the image flying above a town or city or what have you. I think, I mean, for me, I don't, because I've trying to be looking into this image. I think it's meant to represent conflict in the Spanish Civil War. Personally, I think there's some element of inspiration from that, because that's when we first saw the Luftwaffe and the new aircraft and the new capabilities of air power being utilized in conflict. So I think there is definitely some inspiration from that. And I imagine many fascists in Italy who were ideologically aligned with the nationalists in Spain probably felt quite proud of their technological achievements over, say the communists and socialists and anarchists and such. So I mean, this is like a combination of really just showing off the speed, the technological advancements of the nation, and also the sort of superiority of the people.
Because Italian planes were pretty good post World War One up until World War Two. Basically, they were good in the in between part. Basically,
They were very good, and I think even Italy sent volunteers over to Spain along with the Germans as well to help the nationalists. I mean,
okay, and then on the plane subject.
Yeah. So now this one is a this one is an interesting one because this is one that the Guardian in 2005 really did a massive hit piece on, and the reason is the image is meant to represent the bombing of a Basque town during the Spanish Civil War called, I'm sorry if I do pronounce this incorrectly. I think it's called Guernica.
Guernica.
Yeah, Guernica. And what makes this incident so I guess famous in both in left wing circles is the fact that this was the first time such air power was used, and it pretty much razed the entire town. I think it killed off a sizable proportion of the town, and it was seen as a massive major disaster. And so this image is sort of meant to represent from I guess you say the aircraft, the pilot's perspective. And so it's quite interesting because number one, if you look at the positioning of it's quite clear that they're going into a dive bomb. I know that some Guardianistas have suggested that this quite clearly shows the bombardier and he's in his hole and everything ready to release. I don't think it is. I think it's more of a plane doing a dive bomb, but he's diving into quite a strong bit of light, almost.
I think, okay, here's my theories on this one. If you look above, the building above shows that you're never going to be able to pull out of that dive bomb. So this is almost like I see it almost like a suicide mission, and the light coming below is both the explosion in the future, but also some kind of transcendent moment this guy's having in the plane. Do you know what I'm saying? He's reaching his apex because, like I said, there's no way you're coming out of that dive, basically.
No, and also the buildings. I mean, it's because you got the building in front and you got the building sort of at the side. So you could say it is almost like all possible options for him are blocked off at this moment in time, in the dive. And as you said, I mean, you got this light in it, and it's sort of shining around his head, and it's quite spiritual.
My response to this is it looks very Art Deco. It looks like Tamara de Lempicka.
Yeah.
Where you've got like this sort of the clean lines, the sort of the gentle shading and so forth, a very reduced detail. I would say that this does seem to be influenced by Tamara de Lempicka, her paintings of New York from the 1920s and early 30s.
There's an interesting that Deco strand comes into a lot of Italian fascists work identifying, but
obviously in the style. Yeah, we'll get to that if we have time.
Yeah. What I like about this is it's kind of like the other side of Guernica, Picasso's one. This is the prequel.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. In the interest of time, we're gonna keep on moving if that's okay. Now, speaking of the Italian fascists, I've got some horrific propaganda posters.
Oh, this is all the stuff that I refuse to include. Okay, well done.
I was the most edgy of them all, basically. This is from a guy called, I think it's Gino Buscatani. Anyway, but what's interesting about him is that he started out his career as a advertising executive. So all of his previous poster work is like selling stuff like coffee or taking people to the beaches, or like travel posters, etc. But he was employed by the fascists to create a series of posters to I guess put the Americans in a bad light. And one of what obviously exceedingly offensive but quite interesting pieces of work is this one here. You've got America personified as this hunched over black soldier here, and he's got a piece of chalk, and he's got the Venus de Milo, and he's put a $2 sign there. And what's clever about this, you can sort of see this black smoke in the background. It's a work which is saying this is the future of Italy if we lose this. America is going to be selling. The Venus both represents the women of Italy. It's almost kind of like think of the women, but also the art and the culture of Italy. And this is America that has not only grabbed it by the waist, this hunchback abomination, but it's also selling it for only $2. Again, that's that kind of capitalist element to it. So I thought it was obviously horrifically offensive, but at the same time a very interesting piece of propaganda. This one I sort of liked because I just hate London right now. And this was almost kind of like this, in the gladiator duels at the end of the fight. If the person wasn't dying, the emperor would have the final. I think it's the whole audience would either put their thumbs up or thumbs down to show whether they should live. And the Italians have deemed London not worthy of living during World War II, and it's fully aflamed. But again, you could. Sorry. Yeah, exactly. This is what we need. I'm just joking. I'm sorry. And you can see the Tower of London and
Tower Bridge.
Tower Bridge. Yeah, thank you. But again, from an art style, again, it's relatively classical as well. So again, lots of realism coming through. But part of that's to do with his kind of background as a poster painter. But one of my favourite pieces of works is this, which is it's kind of talking through the alliance between Italy, the Nazis, and Imperial Japan. And here we have, again, because obviously the Japanese, basically everyone was still pretty racist. So the Japanese were not well considered by the Axis powers, and this is, and again, they were probably the weakest. I don't know if Japan would be considered weaker than Italy, but I think probably the Italians.
Well, I think actually much stronger, actually.
Yeah, I mean, you could argue that the length of the war itself, you could argue Japan at some point would surpass Germany, but yeah, I mean, I think one thing that especially with the British propaganda at the time, when it came to Japan, it was a lot of it was just because you got the shogun, you got a sort of representative of the shogunate here and everything, and that was a very medieval position, medieval institution, and the British propaganda and the Allied propaganda was just to sort of degrade, obviously, the Japanese society and make them out to be very socially backward. I mean, you got one that you got the modern ships and everything. You got this the shogunate here wielding his samurai sword, and it was well known, obviously, that the Japanese officers in battle at that point would go in in China and such with samurai swords, carry samurai swords, which at that time wasn't very common in the West military. So yeah, it's basically just coming them across as just medieval backward people.
Yes. So that's my my trio of racist posters gone. And speaking of racists.
Speaking of racist, so this is painting. This is ploughing by Julius Paul Junghans, which is a German painter from the 1920s and 30s. So here we have, not much time to spend on this. So this is basically a typical scene that you would find in Nazi art. Nazi art tends to be a lot less exciting than you would imagine it would be. It's actually extremely traditional, basically, essentially 19th century realism, pastoral, of course, scenes of workers, scenes of happy workers working out in the sun, man in sort of working in harmony with nature. So very much related to this. Very much related to the socialist realism. So Nazi art arises just about at the same time as socialist realism, and technically there's very little difference between them. There are a few differences. Is that you have more nudes in German art in the Nazis. This is for various reasons. One of them is that they tend to talk about, they're much more interested in race than the Soviets, and of course, so what you do is you embody the culture and the nation in the figure of the German, i.e., especially the Teutonic woman. So you have a lot of sort of cheesecake 1930s paintings of women who embody the German ideal, which you don't get so much in Russian art. You do get lots of athletes in the Soviet socialist realism. But anyway, so this is an example of the typical sort of art that the Nazis were promoting.
Yeah, interesting to see how similar it is to some of that Soviet work, really, I guess.
Yep. So this is just a shot of some Nazi art. A lot of Nazi art has disappeared, so it's quite difficult to judge. Also, you'll find that you could set up an exhibition of socialist realism with not too much trouble. You could not set up an exhibition of Nazi art. It would simply be howled down. You would be boycotted. There would be calls for your museum to lose funding and so forth. You'd be promoting, white supremacism and whatever. So it's very difficult to judge. So here we have not necessarily a typical painting, but a typical of one strand of Nazi art, which was, of course, the hero painting. So we have the hero of Hitler surrounded by his soldiers. This is the sort of thing that you'd also find in Soviet art. There were also the paintings of Lenin with soldiers. There's paintings of Stalin with soldiers, also Stalin visiting peasants and so forth. This is very common. Again, so here you've got sort of like realism, you've got traditional technique, you've got grand scale, you've got heroism. So it's essentially sort of a 19th century history painting, which has been turned into a style adapted to the 1940s.
Yeah, I just find Hitler just so uninspiring. He's just such like an anti-hero. Like I think there's more heroic qualities in the Chamberlain portrait than that one. But
well, there's a famous picture of Hitler as a medieval knight. I'm sure you've seen that. That's quite a famous poster. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm gonna find this.
It's not entirely convincing, but you can have a look for it.
Okay.
Is it the Teutonic Knight?
Yes, Teutonic Knight. Yeah.
Yeah. That's
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's it. First one. So not entirely convincing, but.
I mean, it's ironic, really, because from what we know about Hitler, he was one of sort of the least noble people to ever exist. He would stroll around functions and kind of just cram food into his mouth from the buffet table and just rant at people, whether or not they wanted to hear it. This is not a knightly character.
And it's interesting that they had pageants in the 1930s where you had people dressed up in sort of medieval costumes in Germany, and this was obviously part of the sort of the nation building effort of the Nazis. So obviously they adopted the imagery of the medieval past, which obviously the Soviets did not, because that was sort of seen as sort of retrogressive. Yeah.
Okay.
So this is an article on my website, alexanderadamsart.wordpress.com. So this is Novecento. This is the 20th century Italian painting. You'll see this is, so when we thought about fascist art, we automatically tend to think of images of Mussolini. We tend to think of futurist influence. But there is another strand, which of course is the call to order, which is a return to values after the First World War. So it's a return to pastoralism, towards landscapes, towards traditional subjects painted in relatively traditional ways. So although there's a touch of modernism about this, you have this other strand that comes through in the 1920s and 1930s in Italy, which is not directly related to futurism. In some cases, these are futurist painters who went back to a more traditional style in order to gain favor with the regime. And interestingly enough, although you'll find that there is a fascist style, an Italian fascist style in architecture and interior design, you'll find that there isn't really a consistent one for art. The art one's much more eclectic. You'll find that the Nazis were quite strict on style and subject. The Italians were a lot more relaxed in terms of art, and it seemed to be that they viewed the strength of their fascism as they could incorporate elements of modernism and pastoralism and traditional art and futurism in a way that Nazism could not.
Mm.
So if anyone wants to read that article, that's on my website, and they can read a bit more about art that was produced in the realist style in the 1930s, which is associated with fascism.
I will tweet this out afterwards so people can check it out and subscribe to Alexander's website. I want to do. We had a Churchill picture. Here we go. As we're speaking of kind of heroes, Panama. Do you want to talk through another one of your portraits?
So yes, I think when it comes to political art and portraits of leaders in the 20th century. We can't really go through without mentioning this one, the Sutherland portrait of Churchill, or what I believe is an unfinished kind of rough version, because quite famously the original was presented to Winston Churchill sometime in the 50s by an artist called Graham Sutherland, and the painting was destroyed by Lady Churchill.
After his death, apparently.
Yes, it was taken as a very severe insult, because this was basically meant to be the final kind of eulogizing portrait of Churchill's career. That's what he had in mind. He wanted the portrait to be of him in his robes as a knight of the Garter, kind of stood with kind of some vision of England in the back, or perhaps the ocean or something. Some very, very grand thing to kind of top off all his years of service. But Sutherland saw basically a very old, tired, quite confused man. And he wanted to paint that. He didn't want to paint a kind of idealistic depiction.
And I think this was described as, like in comparison with the idea of him in his robes, in his finery. This was, I think, a critic described this at the time as like walking in on Churchill while sitting on the toilet.
Yes, and in fact, this was basically. I'll try and find the quote for you now. Churchill was asked about it by a friend, and he said, if I could just find, yes, it said it made him look like a down and out drunk who had been kicked out of the gutter in the Strand, which I quite like. And it's and Churchill called it a remarkable example of modern art combining force and candor, which many see as basically his sort of backhanded compliment of it. Yeah, so that's
it's a pretty brutal. I mean, that is like almost ugly, or like almost intentionally ugly. Like, I think his photograph probably looked better than that.
Well, the thing is, at this period of Churchill's life, I would say he was basically well past the pale. He was not fit to be running the country, and he was kind of swept up in his own kind of aura, I think. So I think this is actually a very true representation of what he looked like. He was just too old and too kind of wizened out from all his years in office and the war. And this was his second tenure as prime minister in the 50s. He was very, very old by this point. So yeah, I think this is actually. I mean, I have. Shall we say, unorthodox views on Churchill, in that I'm quite critical of him from a right wing sort of point of view. But I think this is actually quite a fair portrait. Just so we know what he was like at this stage. Although obviously it was not what Churchill wanted.
I like how it's almost like fading away. I don't know if they had the feet in the original bit.
I'm still not sure of what this.
I think it was actually the plan not to put in the feet, because at this time Sutherland was quite good friends with Francis Bacon, and they both had this habit of sort of leaving off feet.
Yeah. I was going to say it looks very Baconic, but I didn't know. If that was intentional or not. Okay, that's great. Okay, we may need to race through the next ones to keep on top, because I think we've got quite a few.
Yeah, so I mean, very, very briefly, this is an example of fascist architecture. Obviously, you don't want to really get into this very much because it's something that you'll have covered in one of the architecture streams. So this is an example of a sculpture within an architectural setting. So again, one of the strands of fascist art, of Italian fascist art, which is so complex because obviously they're doing modernism, they're doing futurism, they're doing sort of like traditional 19th century. Then they're also harking back, of course, to the Roman past. So you have the heroic Roman figures carved in stone. Not much to say otherwise, apart from fascist architecture is characterized by its sort of its gigantic scale and its simplicity. Also, its using of classical forms, but also of radically simple. So nothing like this was ever built by the Romans. But of course, it's a Roman arch, but of course without without capitals or anything.
Yeah.
An architrave and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah, like if you want to see more about this, there's a film called The Conformist, and that's about a fascist like character that has to assassinate a professor. But they have loads of these shots of the conformist in various government institutions, and you get that sense of scale and grandeur. It's all about like these like beautiful natural stones, but there's this kind of horrific, ominous presence to it at the same time.
One of the characteristics of fascism is that of fascist architecture is that it's incredible scale. It's usually the proportions are usually out of control, and it's often monumental.
No, I think it's definitely interesting. Like, I think the Italian vein is much stronger again compared to the Germans. The Germans is kind of like reheated classicism, but there's nothing interesting about it in my opinion. But the Italians definitely have more useful stuff in there. Okay, moving on to kind of post Second World War. I've got the Sandrum Memorial Chapel. Which is a small chapel, which has kind of like scenes from World War II in, but it has some quite beautiful kind of resurrections in it at the same time. But I'm actually gonna keep us going. Let's get out of the war and into some post-war in the I've put the Surrealists as the
Surrealists. Okay, so you've got the Surrealists are kind of interesting because they're a modernist movement which goes directly against fascism. So this is Hans Bellmer, German artist. He was an illustrator and graphic designer from the 1920s and 1930s. In 1933, when the Nazis came to power, he said, "I am going to do no useful work for the fascists, and I'm going to become an artist and pursue my dreams." So what he did is he built this famous articulated doll. He built several. This is the most famous one. It's an articulated doll based on a fantasy he had about an adolescent relative of his. And he photographed this in very sort of provocative and strange positions. So here you have like this, in a way that's related to expressionist cinema. So you have the doll tied up here in the woods. So this is an example of anti-fascist art by someone who was a German citizen who objected to the Nazis and joined Surrealism expressly to combat fascism, because Surrealism was aligned with communism. It's a big subject. We can't really go into it much in detail here, but as you'll see, the Surrealists had a sort of complex relationship with communism. So Salvador Dali. So Salvador Dali was perhaps the only right-wing member of the Surrealist circle. So here you have a portrait of Lenin in a sort of fantasy vein. This is the Enigma of William Tell from 1934, or Oil on Canvas. This painting is now in Stockholm. And so as you can see, with the extended buttock and the lack of trousers, Lenin is not portrayed in a particularly sympathetic or respectful manner, which the communist surrealists did not appreciate very much. And Salvador Dali was kicked out around 1934 for paintings exactly like this.
No, it's interesting, and again, like, people often are confused with like the stilts and the elongations, and part of that is again the kind of subversion of reality, but also he kind of taps into a lot of kind of Freudian symbology and meaning, like and kind of like dream meanings. So like all of these birds are these birds? Yeah, will translate to a specific meaning, but I think the stilt is like a symbol of. Yeah, like
the crutch is, as Salvador Dali described it himself, as the crutch symbolizes his struggle with impotence.
Yeah, there's a lot of like that kind of Freudian style stuff in his work.
So this is
gonna have to pop off now.
Yeah, no, thanks for jumping in.
Cheers, Al.
Thanks for.
So here we have the Enigma of Hitler, painted in 1939. 1938 was the Munich crisis. Dali painted a number of paintings of telephones in 1938 relating to the Munich crisis. So this is 1939, just before the advent of the Second World War. So this is so one of the problems with surrealism is that it can't really conform to what the communists demanded. The communists demanded realism. Surrealists obviously couldn't do that. They demanded political conformity, which the surrealists couldn't do. And so Salvador Dali embodies this problem in that he says that if I have an obsession with Adolf Hitler, then I will paint Adolf Hitler in my art. And so this obviously didn't go down well with the surrealists, because they said, well, this is close to worshipping, this is close to admiring Hitler. And I think it's clear that Salvador Dali did admire Hitler in the 1930s, although he was slightly more reticent about that later. He became a supporter of Franco. So he was not shy later on about supporting right-wing reactionaries. But this is an example of the kind of art that made the surrealists uncomfortable, which is kind of ironic because, of course, if you go to an American and you ask them, name me a surrealist, the first name that they will say is Salvador Dali. By this time, Salvador Dali had been expelled from the movement by André Breton, the leader, who was a fervent communist.
Do you have a meaning? Can you translate this for us still?
Well, basically, it's no.
No. It's like
it's a collection of motifs that Salvador Dali uses. They're either genuine fixations, or you could say that they are just repetitions, tired repetitions. They become tired repetitions later on, certainly.
Yeah.
But anyway, the telephone is to do with the sort of the impossibility of communication. The microscopically detailed picture of Hitler is obviously his obsession. The beans are something that occur frequently. The landscape in the background is based on Cadaqués, Port Lligat, which is where he had his home in the 1930s and 40s. He spent the war in America, which was probably quite a wise move.
That's interesting, and I like how the kind of bowl swells out into infinity as well. As again, I feel like sometimes we just try and like place a full meaning on some of his portraits, and I think, like you said, because he had so many of these kind of recurring themes, sometimes they're just not.
So it became, in the end, it became window dressing. Unfortunately, there are lots of paintings of the 1940s that are just basically American socialites. When he used to live out in LA, he used to live in Hollywood. And in the 1940s, he was painting like millionaire hostesses, just sort of surrounded by crutches and sort of soft watches and so forth.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to hit the 50s next. Is there? I'm trying. Okay, I'm really bad with my prime ministers. Is this Eden?
No, this is Macmillan. Harold Macmillan.
What's the date? Is he before the 50s?
This would be. He was. To think. I think he was after Eden, wasn't he?
He was after Eden, but before Wilson.
Yeah, that's right. And there's this picture again captures the kind of Victorian stateliness. But there's another one here of him that I want you to just bring up as a comparison piece. Yeah, that one we just went past there. It's kind of, again, obviously that this isn't an official portrait, but I think there's something to be said for that kind of critical style that I think is actually more realistic for what was happening to Britain in this era than the kind of official portrait is, And what I love about this is that he's barely actually in the portrait. He's just he's this tiny little sort of old man who looks half awake, possibly even dead, kind of staring over what looks like a piece of wood with just this kind of endless vista of grey mass just all around him, just kind of lost. And I mean, although he was known for being quite stoic and kind of unflappable, apparently he used to do things like he was violently sick before every prime minister's question appearance and things like that. He was not always as put together as he appeared to be. And although material standards reached a peak, obviously this is really the start of the managed collapse and decline of Britain. So
this is the face of managed collapse. I like that. Yeah,
this is and I wanted to just contrast the official one with this one. Though I have to say, I only stumbled upon that portrait like not long before the stream, so I don't have any reference for what the context is or who painted it or why. I'm afraid.
It's cool. I like his natty cravat though. That's good styling.
Yeah,
but yeah. It's a definite. It's interesting how they were still trying to kind of show the prime minister in this kind of quite Victorian style
with his robes.
Even that late. Okay, rolling back a little bit, I've got some stuff on the 50s and specifically the Festival of Britain. So this is kind of post-war Britain, and what I think is interesting about the Festival of Britain is that it's the first, I guess, like mainstream government, like modernist push in terms of art style and art direction. And so I don't know how much you know about it, but it's kind of like a big kind of World Fair exhibition that they did in the 50s to kind of show the future and the progress in technology and science and all those.
What was Mendelssohn's father, one of the organisers?
Is that right?
Yeah, I think Peter Mendelssohn's father was involved.
I would not be surprised. I genuinely think the Festival of Britain has this kind of quite progressive and evil undertone to it. But it's interesting is because this is the new kind of Americanized liberal vision of Britain, basically solidified into a little festival. So they created this little area in the South Bank. You can still see the kind of Royal Festival Hall, which operates as like a concert hall and general hangout space. And they had a number of
skating park included.
Yeah, exactly. This, of course, you can see Alexander do some kick flips down there on a Saturday, I'm sure. And then they had a variety of other buildings, but as part of this, they had lots of this kind of leaflets and guides on these different areas. Interestingly, all of the iconography was done by a propaganda artist working in the Second World War. So they actually took him doing propaganda paintings to doing this propaganda view of this new version of Britain. And again, I think it's just interesting as, again, a lot of people look on it quite fondly, but I think it's one of those, as I said before, I feel like England, even at the beginning of like the Second World War, still has this kind of quite fuddy-duddy Victoriana sense to it. But following the Second World War, all of that's kind of swept away, and this is our kind of futurism in some ways. This kind of Americanized modernism, and you can feel that kind of American vibes from the kind of general stylings. But again, even the kind of lion and the unicorn updated into this kind of abstract, and I don't know. I think that lion looks a bit.
Looks a bit toothless, doesn't he?
Yeah, he's a toothless like lion ceramic.
Like a cat, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's just the whole iconography of the Festival of Britain is the kind of the beginning of the end, and part of that facade sort of leads to this face across there. Okay, going back to some kind of post World War II Soviet.
Yeah, well, I think we can get through this quite quickly. So this is a big stone sculpture of Lenin from Lenin Platts in Berlin. So you've got some nice socialist architecture behind. This is I discussed the demolition of this because, of course, this was part of the GDR. I discussed the fate of many of the GDR monuments, socialist monuments, in my book, Iconoclasm, Identity Politics and the Erasure of History, available now. And this was obviously there were a large number of Lenin statues and socialist statues left in the Eastern Bloc following the collapse of communism in 1990. And their fates varied. Most of them have gone. Some of them still remain. This is one of the biggest losses. The head is now in a museum somewhere else. The rest of the monument is gone. Symbolically, Leninplatz is now entitled United Nations Platz.
Oh, it's like they haven't replaced anything.
Yes,
I mean, I almost prefer it being named Leninplatz. I feel like that stands for more than the United Nations does.
Yes, yeah.
Nice.
So here's a mural from 1964. This is a mosaic, an exterior mosaic, I believe. Just an example of how socialist realism after the 1950s or after the 1940s became more overtly modernist. It became less realistic. There was a sense that socialist realism had kind of run its course. It was looking a bit embarrassing. It was looking a bit out of date. It looked like propaganda. So there was this move to make it more appealing, more modernist, more fun, more colourful. And so this is an example. Of course, obviously, an exterior work and a mosaic. Being realistic is not very easy. So obviously, the mosaic style lends itself to being more flat, more modernist, more simplified than realist work.
I think what's interesting for me is that maybe swapping these kind of like handsome and beautiful looking people, swap them out for a diverse cast, and this could be a mural from any modern school. Subject matter wise. You've got things like the classic Dove of Peace, the science, the work.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing expressly political in the style at all. No.
No, interesting.
So this is an example of the Russian realism that you get from the Socialist Realism. This is a little bit out of date. This is sort of out of order.
I've put it out of order. Sorry.
Yeah, so don't worry about that. So this is an example of the Socialist Realism sculpture that we talked about with Constantin Meunier at the end of the last stream. So go back and have a look at stream number 2 if you want to know where this ideal came from. So this is Frida Kahlo. Self-portrait with Stalin. Stalin died in 1953, I think it was. This is painted in 1954. So this is after Stalin's death. This is just before her death because she's close to the end at this time. It's not a particularly good painting by Kahlo. I mean, obviously, she was quite sick at the end. She was taking a lot of drugs because she was in a lot of pain and she was bedbound. It's quite a sad story. But she was a dedicated communist. And there was a strong communist movement in the 1920s and 30s, and actually they did have a socialist/communist government in the 1920s, I believe. And they formed an interesting collective which made graphic art. So Diego Rivera and the Mexican muralists were closely related to this. So here we have so here's Diego Rivera's Detroit industry. Yeah.
I don't mean to interrupt, but it's interesting she painted a portrait of Stalin like that, because am I correct in thinking that she actually had a sexual relationship with Leon Trotsky when he was in Mexico?
Yes, apparently so. That's correct.
Right, interesting.
And one of the Mexican muralists was, I can't remember which one it was, but one of them actually set out to assassinate Trotsky because he was a Stalinist. So yeah, they were deeply involved in the Trotsky, and André Breton was also working with Trotsky in the 1930s as well.
Maybe this is her way of getting back at her ex.
Yeah, and well,
Stalin's my best friend now.
Well, the private life of Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera is very complicated, and there have been lots of films and books about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is just an example of socialist art made by Mexican muralist Diego Rivera, painted in the 1930s and 1940s. Rivera and Kahlo went to stay in Detroit, New York, and San Francisco while he was painting murals. She was relatively unknown at the time. So his paintings were obviously, it was sort of workers, industrialization, the suffering of the indigenous Americans, and Pan-American unity.
Cool.
So here's one of the graphic works that I talked about. This is a print from 1950. It's a lino cut, but this is typical of the print collective based in Mexico City. Mexican prints have quite an interesting history. If you go to my website, you'll find several articles on the print collectives and Mexican prints, which were very closely tied to social themes. The reason they set up this print collective was because they wanted to distribute prints to the working people. They wanted these to be not collector's items, but things that a worker could afford. So it would only be a few pesos, and it wouldn't be an investment. So this is another Rivera mural. Right. Okay. So feminism. I've only chosen one just to give you an example of feminist art, which started in the 1960s. This is by Judy Chicago, I believe, painted in the 1970s. I think there's several versions of this. So feminist art, big subject. I'm not going to get into it here, but basically it's to do with well, you know, all about sort of attacking the patriarchy, attacking the establishment art, attacking establishment style. So it's deliberately avant-garde, it's deliberately crude, it often relates to women's issues, so it's related to bodies, the female body, childbirth, and the female experience as seen through the eyes of feminists, of course. So it's not entirely objective. Of course, not that any art is entirely objective. And it's extremely emotional, it's provocative, and of course you could do like a whole stream on feminist art, but I wouldn't join you for it, I'm afraid.
I mean, yeah, this is basically nightmare fuel for me right now.
Yes.
But we've covered it now. So okay, now we've got a couple more just to round us out. And just a series of four more portraits. Who do you want to start with first, Panama?
Well, let's go chronological. So we'll start with Major. Actually, no, let's start with Mao. Sorry, I forgot. I mean, this is basically just cheating slightly because, again, I don't think it was an official portrait. It was one that Andy Warhol did. And he quite famously did a lot of images of Mao in his kind of repetitional style. And it's just interesting to me the way that he's kept the face and the facial expression from the official portrait of Mao, but he's kind of tweaked the color grading and the way the rest of the image is composed. And although I know that Warhol was not a Maoist, he almost gives him a weird sort of halo around his face. Because I think that when Warhol did art like this, there is a kind of idolization aspect to it. Though I think the expert for this would be Mr. D, because I don't actually know that much about Warhol. But yeah, this just sort of interested me as a kind of what a Western pop artist who also wasn't a communist would do with a portrait of Mao.
Yeah, he obviously a big part of Warhol's work was to do with cultural icons. So he did the Campbell soup can, he did the Coca-Cola can, did the American dollars. He also did screen prints of Leonardo's Last Supper and so forth. So yeah, he was interested in icons, and of course Mao was a cultural icon, and he did this through sort of the various processing. So it was processed through the photograph, then which was reproduced and circulated, and then of course appropriated by the artist. So yeah, so you're quite right. He was interested in cultural icons, and he was definitely not a Maoist. Although interestingly, I know that it's come up recently that someone was giving an interview, some Democrat was giving an interview, and there was a Mao portrait over his
I saw
mantelpiece
that
or something.
they cropped it out, didn't they?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, from this kind of quite scant reading I've done around Warhol, it seems to me like he was more of a kind of an anarcho-capitalist in a sense.
He was also interested in celebrity as well. So Elvis, Marilyn Monroe, Jackie O. So obviously Mao was a celebrity as well as a cultural icon.
Moving on from one icon to one definite anti-icon.
Well, again, I believe this is actually an official portrait, and it just strikes me because it's so skewed and kind of silly. Just the way he kind of what would you call it? Is it sort of almost like a fisheye?
Fisheye lens. Yeah,
where you've got kind of him and the chair he's sat in, kind of wave out at you like some sort of horrible LSD trip, it's or whatever, it's very sort of if you've ever seen the film adaptation of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, that's a vibe I get from this sort of the way he comes kind of slithering out of the picture at you almost, and the way that everything seems off, and there's a kind of what appears to be, is that snow piled up outside the window? In the absolute dead of winter, it's like this again, kind of just invocative of the state of the country. This kind of very grand but very bland stateroom with its kind of gold framed pictures, but just in the middle of the room with no sense of real purpose or indication that he is a leader or in a position of authority, sits the prime minister.
He's an untethered centrist, perhaps.
Yes, and also smack in the middle of the picture. That's I didn't pick up on that. Yeah, that's quite that may be a comment.
I like the light next to him. The light's on, but there's no one home.
Yeah, it's just it's interesting to me. Although I don't hate it like I hate the Blair picture, which we should come on to now. Again, just
the Dark Lord himself.
Do I even have to say anything?
Yes.
Like, just look at this. Look at this. And I believe this was actually painted, or he posed for this in his office, which did look like that. He had a kind of graffiti style mural on the wall behind him, like that.
Interesting. That says a lot. Yeah, the no surrender,
and just that horrible look. There's Charles Anthony Linton Blair.
Just compare the outfit here. The noble if fuddy-duddy Victoriana of Magene's.
But it's very telling, though, isn't it? Quite accurate.
But what I really hate about this is that Macmillan portrait you just showed. I mean, Macmillan kind of it's not fake for him to wear that, even though the country he's running is no longer what it was when he was a young man. He is of that tradition, and the clothes do fit him. He is kind of this is how he would dress in his everyday life, whether or not he was the prime minister, with the exception of perhaps the red academic robe. But that Blair picture, that Charles Anthony Linton Blair never in his life probably dressed like that, other than to pretend he was something he wasn't. It's just
I've just gone down to Greg's. Guys.
Yeah.
I've had my PR team follow me
it reeks of just artificiality, just horrendous modern artificiality. And again, this does still count as the 20th century, because he was elected in 1997. But the next picture, I am cheating, because obviously Obama is this century. But I just had to include it because I don't know if we're doing another of these streams, and this just, again, just why? Like, what? Like, it's, I mean, at least with the Blair portrait, it's kind of, even if it's telling us something horrible, it's still telling us something. Whereas I don't even know what this is trying to portray, really. Even the kind of pose he's in is questionable, kind of hunched forward like that. I don't really know. Now, I know that some people have talked about the artist that painted this, who I can't. I think is that his name up there in the?
Yes, Kehinde Wiley. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, is this indicative of his style?
Yes.
Yes, it is. I don't only know a little bit about him because I don't really cover contemporary art, but he's a black artist, and that was why he was chosen for this.
He did an exhibition near. Well,
his paintings are characterized by their gigantic size. I imagine that large parts of them are painted by assistants, and that's not like a slur or anything. I mean, a lot of artists in the past did use assistants, but it contributes to the rather sort of flat, plasticky, posterized nature. These like giant. I mean, these like sort of 6 foot tall or 8 foot tall. These are huge pictures. Yeah, and there you go. As an example.
I mean,
so obviously this is painted by assistants.
It's to me, it's indicative of really kind. And again, this is a bit off topic, perhaps. Well, I suppose not, because it's to do with power, but really kind of schizophrenic attempts that we've seen over the past few hundred years, I suppose, of American blacks to kind of form some sort of coherent identity. This sort of art, it's sort of all in one style, and it kind of gives something grand. But I think it's basically not something that's actually possible. That's all I can say on this, really. I would have to look into him and his art more, though, to qualify that.
Yeah, like it's interesting. Like, for example, the chair is obviously it's antique, so it's kind of reminiscent of the past. So they're trying to pull in that kind of traditional elements. He's kind of in this kind of power pose, arms folded, which is kind of a bit standoffish, staring straight at you. So giving that kind of confrontation, and like immediately kind of capturing your attention. But then there's like, I think again, it's something small, but like the left foot slightly raised up is actually a bit of a sign of weakness. I think it's there's something awkward, and it doesn't really work in terms of the pose.
It's not a good pose, no.
He sort of ended up leaning forward, and then again, I just find the kind of the floral stuff at the background just a bit of a novelty. Or do you know what I'm saying? It's whatever, like Dali's, crutches or whatever. It's literally a bit of a crutch for the artist again. Because again, I'm sort of loving this this sort of, again, it's ridiculous and stupid, but it sort of works, and it's organic, and it feels true. Well, I feel like just as this has a fakeness to it, like the kind of graffiti Britain, there's something undeniably fake about Obama as well. So
yeah, or well, to be completely honest, I mean, I think that the fakeness of this comes less from Obama and more just from the kind of pretensions of the artist. I think that in the fact that rather than like even a kind of Sutherland style portrait that kind of shows them as they really are, and it's very sort of unheroic and quite sort of realist. Like that, I think, would be better than this bizarre kind of attempt by the artist to put something forward that isn't really there. Because whichever way you look at it, Obama is not a particularly remarkable man. And I'm not saying that you have to be. I mean, neither are several of the people we've seen in the portraits, but there's just something that, like, there is no real reason for this portrait to be the way it is. There's no reason for the background to look like that. There's no reason for him to pose like that. There's no reason for this kind of fanciful style when it comes to someone like Obama. This doesn't tell us anything, or it doesn't tell us anything kind of valid. I'll just say
I think that the two main things is that it was commissioned from a black artist, and it's a very large painting. I think it went into the official collection of one of the museums in Washington. Right. So I think those are probably the two salient points that you need to note.
It's interesting, isn't it? Those kind of like official collections, because they almost act like a form of like whatever, Stalin with his, Soviet realism is the only art that's approved. As soon as you have that kind of cultural drag, you're certainly going to pull in, whatever art is, politically au fait at the time, aren't you? If you have such a strong call. But I think that's rounded us up to the full 2 hours. And
has left us in a suicidal state.
I know. Have I missed any paintings out at all?
Not from me, no.
Okay. Let me just stop the screen. There we go. I think it's been an interesting journey, and I think it does just show just how connected things are. Either something as direct as those kind of political figures in portrait, or something as simple as a horse ploughing a field has so much kind of political energy behind it. It's been a real interesting ride. So thanks very much, guys, for taking us through. I am planning another stream probably in next month, but the title is yet to be announced. So please subscribe, smash the like button, ring the bell. Oh, I'm so awful
for notifications. Yes,
notifications. But Alexander, I don't know if there's anything you want to kind of to plug apart from the book.
Apart from the book Iconoclasm, which you can find on online websites, you can buy. I'm now told it's available in Kindle or ebook or something. It wasn't previously, so if you did look for it then and you couldn't find it, it's now available. And also, if you follow Ferro on Twitter or something, I think he'll post a link to the website where you can read about that Italian painting and lots of other articles, which are either on my website or they are linked on my website. And thank you for the interesting discussions.
No problem at all. Panama, have you been up to anything you want to plug?
Well, I will probably release a video in the next few weeks, so check out my channel for that. I'm probably plugging this way too early. It won't be for a long while yet, but I'm thinking of bringing out a bunch of books, not through traditional means. I'll probably use Kindle self printing or whatever it's called, or just publishing on via Amazon rather than using, as I said, rather than using my agent or anything. But I will bring out a series of books that will be published under a pseudonym, basically partly to avoid a dox and partly because they'll be quite controversial. So that's basically it. I again can't really give you any more info than that, or what they'll even be about yet. As I said, probably way too early. But that's just something to watch out for.
How can we hear about the books? Where are you going to announce it?
I will announce them when they come out. Through I'm
so much history.
I'm not
brown
really
envelopes.
I'm not trying to bring out an audience. I will, if you have any means of contacting me, then I will. Then you'll know. But yeah,
this is the thing where Panama contacts you. You do not contact Panama.
That's not for you to know.
Exactly. Well, yeah. On that note, thank you so much, and thanks everyone for watching, and hopefully speak to you guys soon. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.